Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Andiamo avanti.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where today we are going to be diving into what I would consider to be the most exciting of topics in the history of Lorenzo the Magnificent's court, and that is large-scale mythological painting, which I know happens to be, for a lot of us, the essence of what drew us into Renaissance art. At least that's true for me. To look at this genre, we will really need to zoom in because, contrary to how we perceive these subjects now, in the 1480s, they were truly a novel form, starting with, you know who, Sandro Botticelli. So buckle up because we're going to take a close look at the nature and the context of Botticelli's mythological paintings, and then we're going to explore the works that came in light of Botticelli, especially one extraordinary work created by Luca Signorelli in 1490 after his arrival at the Medici court. Even for those who are not formally educated in Renaissance art, one thing that has breached the threshold of our common and shared visual vocabulary of the world is Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and his particular treatment of mythological subjects as its own painting style. Before we dive into that, a brief note is that Lorenzo the Magnificent is hardly ever the direct patron of these works. However, as we've discussed, the culture of his court, which saw widespread and often public revival of pagan mythological themes, only happened because Lorenzo had this fascination in common with the humanist circle, which were the poets and philosophers of his own personal inner court, which in turn created a sudden interest in patronage of mythological subjects, especially those of which were Medici allies. This type of painting is directly related to his influence. So, Birth of Venus, just like the Primavera, which I have already dedicated a whole podcast to, is in all likelihood commissioned by Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de Medici, also known as Lorenzo il Popolano. That is not Lorenzo the Magnificent. That's Lorenzo the Magnificent's cousin and also his ward, who also received an excellent humanistic education with Marsilio Ficino Poliziano. And Il Popolano even studied in the Medici circle with someone named Amerigo Vespucci, that Florentine companion to Christopher Columbus, who gave the American continents their modern name. The Vespucci, too, would follow Lorenzo's example after Botticelli and commission large-scale mythological works. I want to be very clear. This is a trend started and codified by Botticelli as a painter of this elite group of Medici. It is also important to stress that Sandro Botticelli was indeed embedded in this humanist circle, but with him there is always the question of what his personal philosophy was, or if he was simply a master of marketing his talents as a painter. He could have just been really good at making money because he knew how to produce things that people want, right? But we know that after Lorenzo the Magnificent died and after Savonarola took over, that very uptight Dominican priest, if you remember, Botticelli was known to have made several works reflecting this doomsday friar's beliefs, this very horrible apocalyptic version of devotional painting, even going as far as burning some of his own works in Savonarola's bonfires of the vanities. It would appear that he was probably more towards the religious side than he was towards the Neoplatonic humanist side, even though Botticelli is the one to produce the most famous works of early mythological painting. With that in mind, although the dozens and dozens of work produced by Botticelli and his workshop, his claim to fame, mythological works, there are only 4 of them. And it seems it was an exclusive genre that he painted while in Lorenzo's circle. Those 4 would be the Primavera, the Birth of Venus, which were both likely commissioned by Lorenzo il Popolano, Palace in the Centaur, my personal favorite, which Lorenzo the Magnificent probably commissioned himself, and Venus and Mars, which was likely by the Vespucci family. Botticelli scholar Anna de Benedetti recently published a really, really awesome book called Botticelli, Artist and Designer, which treats mostly the scope of his religious works. However, when she talks about his mythological painting, she sums up this historical moment in his relationship with Lorenzo il Popolano quite nicely. She says, quote, "The critical literature on these paintings is vast, and in this instance we need only to recall that their respective iconographical program was devised by scholars and poets working for the Medici, in particular Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de Medici. He was the second cousin and ward of Lorenzo the Magnificent, a prodigious young man who would become a refined humanist and Botticelli's most important patron during the last 2 decades of the 15th century. Consequently, the mythological scenes result from a combination of Neoplatonist themes developed by Marsilio Ficino, as well as vernacular poetry and classical literature revived in particular by Poliziano, who had been appointed professor of rhetoric at the Studio, which is the sort of university idea of Florence, in 1480 after a few years spent in the Medici house as the tutor of Lorenzo's sons." End quote. It is all connected, Renaissance people. Art to literature, poetry to philosophy to politics, and ultimately the creation of a new genre of painting in the 1480s, with Botticelli working under this cultural circle. In this critical period, we see manifesting in painting the same themes and topics in the literary world, and that is happening twofold. More educated elites are commissioning translations of Greek and Latin classics, which they then share, read, and discuss and philosophize about. Then writers are also creating new works based on ancient models. And we saw this in Lorenzo's poetry, and we see it with Poliziano's poetry as well. A work like The Birth of Venus likely draws from several sources, including Poliziano's Stanze per la giostra di Giuliano de' Medici, verses for the joust of Giuliano de' Medici, which is a mythological work in reverence to Giuliano de' Medici and Simonetta Vespucci. We've got some Vespucci here again, which is loosely based on the Stanze per la giostra, loosely based on the ancient Roman poet Ovid. Okay. At the same time, the painting recalls the Neoplatonic philosophy of Marsilio Ficino, who believed that the story of the birth of Venus could be read allegorically in Platonic terms, where Venus, rising from the sea in the aftermath of Uranus being castrated, is representative of beauty itself being born within the minds of humankind. This major preoccupation of Renaissance thinkers. So, Botticelli then is inspired by Poliziano's verses, plus the popularity of an ancient poet, Ovid, plus the teachings and philosophies of the Neoplatonists about the idea of Venus. And these are all being sort of thrown onto a canvas in a very complicated way. So, what do we have in The Birth of Venus anyway? Venus, like I said, has been spawned by the union of Uranus's castrated parts that were thrown into the sea, and thus she is born in absolute divine perfection upon a large clamshell. Zephyr, the west wind, associated with springtime, with gentleness. He's the gentle breeze. Blows Venus ashore, where a nymph-like attendant springs forward in the moment of her arrival to dress her. The work itself, stylistically, is indicative of what we define as a Botticellian style. Figures are not grounded firmly, they appear to sort of float. Botticelli insists on hard outline and contour, very different from what later Renaissance painters are going to do with blurring those lines via Leonardo and Giorgione, what have you. This creates a quality not unlike the way in which earlier medieval art depicts holy subjects. Naturalism, in the sense that maybe Leonardo da Vinci would obsess over, is not a primary concern here with Botticelli. He created instead a work that is removed from our natural world, something that shows he knew the aesthetic of ancient Roman painting and is centered upon this divine ideal, perfection that cannot be rendered naturalistically. It's ideal. we know for a certainty that these qualities are intentional and not a reflection of any lack of technical skill, which Botticelli shows repeatedly to have in other works that he's done. So the Birth of Venus, unlike the Primavera, is a work on canvas. So some scholars have suggested that this means it was used as a ceremonial banner, but that's not proven for sure. But if it was, that means that this would have been a very public piece of art. And if you have been to the Uffizi in Florence and waded through the crowds and been able to enjoy a moment in the Botticelli room, you probably noticed in all the reproductions that you've seen of the Birth of Venus, none of them capture the breathtaking use of gold in the painting, which serves as highlights in her hair, glimmering and shimmering as she moves, or more as you move in front of her. It's one of those works that you have to see in person in your lifetime if you can, and spend a long time with it and let the crowds move on. And we can analyze Botticelli's Venus and Mars from around 1483 in a similar way, which was possibly painted after Primavera, but before Birth of Venus. It depicts the famous love affair between Venus and Mars, where love and passion has subdued the god of war into sleep. It's very often argued that these gods are modeled after Giuliano de' Medici and Simonetta Vespucci. Again, those two who were the inspiration for Poliziano's poetry that then reflects in the Birth of Venus. There is a good argument that this was a Vespucci commission, whether or not Simonetta herself modeled for Venus. Botticelli often enjoyed Vespucci patronage, and he's even buried in their family chapel. So look here, buzzing above the head of the sleeping Mars, you see a wasp nest. Vespe in Italian, the Vespucci. And like I said before, the Vespucci were directly related to Lorenzo's circle, even participating in the intellectual activities of the Medici court. Marsilio Ficino appears again in this painting too, and I don't mean he appears physically, I mean his philosophy, as he produced astrological writings and characterizations stating that Venus is the master of Mars. In the end, a very rudimentary reading tells us clearly that this is a statement of the power of love and divine beauty over violence and war. If Venus, in both the Birth of Venus and Venus in Mars, is divine intellect or beauty manifest in the minds of mankind, then these paintings directly address the thought of the humanist movement under Lorenzo, who believed their adoration of Platonic thought through the city of Florence could subdue the world. Okay, it should come as no surprise that such works were produced in the 1480s when Lorenzo had solidified his power and achieved relative peace for the Florentine Republic, give or take. At least as far as the turbulent history of the Renaissance is concerned, the 1480s is a relatively peaceful moment. The time for frivolous mythological painting, I suppose.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
I don't think it's frivolous. So with all these threads in our minds, it's safe to say that Botticelli launched a new genre of painting under Lorenzo's influence. That is, large-scale mythological painting, specifically of this size and quality. I don't want you guys to leave this discussion here thinking nobody was depicting mythological figures before Botticelli in the 1480s, because of course that is not true. I'm talking about the high intellectual type of large-scale mythological paintings like the Birth of Venus, like the Primavera, Pallas and the Centaur, Venus and Mars. And in a similar period, following Botticelli, following his example, the very enigmatic and very eccentric painter Piero di Cosimo would also paint a Mars and Venus, as well as several other mythological subjects, including Perseus and Andromeda, which I have made a YouTube video about, so I suggest you guys go check that out to see what other painters were doing in reaction to Botticelli. Likewise, near the end of the 1480s, Luca Signorelli had arrived in Florence. Signorelli was a painter from the nearby town of Cortona, and much of his early career was based in the town of Arezzo, where he made a name for himself. For those of you who know Signorelli, especially his frescoes in Orvieto, his Florence period comes before he goes to Orvieto and makes his masterpiece in the San Brizio chapel there, which I also did a YouTube video on, so go watch that. Much of what we know about Signorelli comes from Giorgio Vasari, right? The biographer of the Renaissance artist who actually knew Signorelli. Vasari knew him and met him when Vasari was a young boy in Arezzo. However, we simply need to observe the work that Signorelli did for Lorenzo's court to understand how quickly he tapped into the cultural atmosphere of Florence. Dear listeners, the work I'm about to talk to you about is one of the greatest tragedies of the history of art because it was destroyed in Berlin in the end of World War II. That's right, the painting no longer exists. But thankfully, we do have high-resolution photos of it, so we can see it digitally. I will share it, of course. The painting has different names, but it is commonly referred to as the Court of Pan or the Education of Pan. And I'll just call it Pan. Okay, the Pan painting. Yeah, that's Pan as in not what you cook with, the pastoral god of the satyrs, player of the pan flute, maybe you've heard of that, the lewd and beastly god of earthly pleasures, the god that was very much admired in Lorenzo's circle. He even took Pan as a subject for his own poetry in his Apollo and Pan that he wrote as early as the end of the 1460s. So this work by Signorelli is horizontal. It's about the same size as the Primavera, slightly smaller, and about the same size as the Birth of Venus. Birth of Venus is smaller than Primavera. I think this painting was somewhere in between, like a wall size. Pretty big. Not that big. Pretty big. Yet, unlike Botticelli's work, we have not Venus, but we have a male protagonist, so to speak, right? If we look at Pan alongside Botticelli's works, there's little doubt that stylistically and in terms of genre, Signorelli is picking up on the tastes of the Laurentian court of a painting genre started by Botticelli. That's what this is. Indeed, Vasari tells us that this painting was commissioned by Lorenzo de Medici. Of course, we've already discussed it. There are two Lorenzo de Medicis in this story. So, was it the Magnificent himself or his cousin Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de Medici, Lorenzo il Popolano? Still, what does Vasari say? He reports that Signorelli painted, quote, a number of nudes upon a canvas for Lorenzo de Medici, unquote there, a patron who, Vasari says, was unwilling to be surpassed in magnificence. So for our purposes, no, it doesn't matter which Lorenzo commissioned it, because you can also call other people magnificent in the Renaissance. They didn't only call Lorenzo the Magnificent magnificent. Yet I think Vasari alludes clearly that Lorenzo the Magnificent was the patron of Luca Signorelli's Pan. And while scholarly interpretation of the Pan painting are numerous, there's a lot. Most sources agree that the textual reference used for Pan's iconography, how he appears in the painting, comes from the ancient writer Servius, displaying Pan with horns that look like a crescent moon and a breastplate that shows the stars. So this comes right out of Servius. So we know that they're looking at ancient sources for how they are building iconography like a saint, guys. Like a saint. They are building iconography for Pan that doesn't really stick that much, but that's neither here nor there. Beyond that, there is no absolute interpretation that is satisfactory as to where this story comes from or what version of any number of Pan myths it's trying to tell. And it is not uncommon for Renaissance artworks, even if we don't know a single source, for them to contain simultaneous readings that can also be contradictory. Isn't that lovely? I am of the mind that this painting speaks more directly to an erotic culture that flourished in the later years of Lorenzo's reign. And what I mean is male to male homoerotic culture, the same variety that flourished under Cosimo de' Medici in the age of Donatello. This is my version of historical analysis. Michael Rocky, who did the daunting work of compiling the data around sodomy accusations in Florence, had this to say about homoeroticism in Lorenzo's 1480s. And I'm going to quote here. If, as is commonly assumed, the humanistic and Neoplatonic ideals of the Renaissance had any influence in fostering a more tolerant environment for sodomy in Florence, for all, not just a favored elite, then this was realized only during this decade of relative impunity for sodomites. But again, the decisive factors probably had more to do with considerations of public order and the current political climate, especially the domestic peace of the 1480s. End quote. We use the word sodomy because that is how we refer to same-sex acts between males. In the early modern period, there was no homosexual identity. It was an act in which one did, and we usually refer to those non-judgmentally as sodomites or sodomy in the academic sense. What does that mean? 1480s, according to all of the archival data, was possibly a time of relative impunity for sodomite activity, in which we happen to know that Botticelli had charges, Poliziano had charges, and now we have this hyper-erotic pagan work of art coming directly from Lorenzo the Magnificent's commission to Luca Signorelli. Because Pan famously pursues both male and female lovers, and one argument is that the nude male figure in front of the enthroned Pan is his lover Olympus. And yet, Pan also is in love with the nymph Syrinx, which is actually another name for the pan flute. So there's the different modes of sexual tension in this painting, and a lot of naked people lying around playing flutes, which, for the ears only of my adult listeners, I don't have to tell you what this alludes to, and that reading would not have been lost on the Renaissance viewer either. To make matters worse, the Renaissance viewer would also not have missed that the composition of this work is mirroring what is called a sacra conversazione, or a traditional composition of a Virgin Mary enthroned among saints. So you now take a religious iconography, slap it onto Botticelli's new large-scale mythological genre, and put Pan and a bunch of naked pagans on it. Isn't that just saucy? Isn't that just scandalous? Could Pan, the god of lasciviousness and pleasure, really be a substitute for the Virgin Mary? I don't think so. Not for, well, maybe I do think so. I don't know. I like the thought of it. What I hope to convey in that parallel is that between the groundbreaking innovation of Botticelli and the daring of Signorelli's Pan, which by all means is a monumental work in the history of art, this genre of large-scale mythological painting was intentional and spoke to the very specific attitudes of the upper class of Florentines under Lorenzo's influence, specifically notions that seemed to rub against the loosening grip of religious Renaissance orthodoxy. And this all happens in a very specific decade. We have to understand that this genre of painting was a result of widespread changes in cultural consciousness, and that Lorenzo's Florence, whether we like him or not, was a space of expanded artistic liberty. However, like we see in our world today too, the pendulum always swings back, and when Lorenzo dies, Savonarola bends Florence back into religious extremism, but it's already too late. Botticelli, and we mentioned Piero di Cosimo, and Luca Signorelli, and others had already laid the groundwork. And from here on out, as many of you probably know, mythological subjects are going to dominate Western art for centuries to come. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. It was a shallow look at the very complicated nature of the birth, the birth of Venus. Let's actually put it in those terms. So thank you all for listening and tuning in. Until next time, arrivederci.